Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. And in many ways, this presentation is an introduction to me. This is my first year of doing my resident fellow, plus I'm over at the Minneapolis campus, so probably quite a few of you don't know of me or have met me before. But the resident fellowship has given me the opportunity to spend some time here over at St. Paul, so I'm really appreciative of receiving it. And so today's talk is I guess you could say an introduction to kind of this broader idea about knowledge brokering. I put some definitions in for this, but also some ideas coming out of my fellowship. So it's preliminary in some ways because this is just the first year of my fellowship. But it's a topic I'm very interested in and working with others and on this topic. So back in November, I think I was asked, could you give us a title and an abstract? And so I look back at it recently, I'm saying, oh, that's what I wrote. But in many ways, this question still fits, and the basic abstract that I put together for this talk. One is knowledge systems for ecosystem services. Where does the cultural dimension fit in? In order to understand this, it's good to have a little bit of my background. I interface between the world of science and the world of design. I am a hybrid. I've been kind of an interdisciplinary person with that particular perspective from the very beginning. And with trends in academia in the past 20 years, it's only gotten better for people like myself to integrate in different disciplines and build on my interests. And it's gotten to a point now where we're at an important, I guess you could say, moment where the integration of design thinking into the sciences is becoming more popular and more accepted. So some of the ideas you'll see today are really kind of this interfacing between these two worlds, because it's the two worlds that I spend quite a bit of time in. So this is what I will provide today is my perspective, some opportunities and challenges facing knowledge systems and ecosystem services, especially in highly modified and intensively used landscapes. I'm particularly interested in urban landscapes. And so you have some language in here that actually interfaces with science and design, the language and words of ecosystem services, but also the kinds of landscape that are typically maybe considered designed landscapes. And here are some definitions. I'll go through 5 of them. Knowledge system, knowledge broker, knowledge brokering, cultural dimensions of ecosystem services, highly modified and intensively used landscapes. When we think about knowledge as a system, I was asked to submit an image that could really represent that. And to me, this image of kind of the interconnected branches of this grove of hawthorn trees, it's a garden in Chicago at the Art Institute, really represents that connectivity we get with a knowledge system. It's somehow all of these contributions of different people together are touching to create this canopy, something that's greater than the whole. And if we think about a knowledge system, it is really about, you can say, the tree of knowledge, but it also gets in this idea of the relationship between ideas and people, and that when people interact in disciplines is that you're creating a body of knowledge, not only intellectual, but the social networks that emerge out of that. And when we look at trends in interdisciplinarity, but also transdisciplinarity, that is very much looking at how do we solve environmental problems with knowledge bases more than our own. So when we look at knowledge broker, I see this as someone who starts off with an interdisciplinary perspective and finds out they enjoy these kinds of roles. They're a cross-pollinator of ideas among people of different disciplines. They naturally can kind of move between different groups. A facilitator who helps to move scientific discovery and application forward in a strategic manner. They may be called a futurist or have that kind of perspective on their work. They also might be considered a strategist and maintaining different roles depending on the situation. They also can be an advocate for distant goals on the horizon that are challenging to perceive and understand. And when we start to look at knowledge brokering, it is a collaborative process for translating ideas and building relationships in networks. And these particular ideas could be the networks or the people who have these ideas into networks. And that's where we get into this idea of the interconnectivity of knowledge systems. The goal is to improve usability and transferability of these ideas and enhance understanding across disciplines. One emphasis is that the relationship between scientists and non-scientists is an important emphasis, trying to take scientific knowledge and you could say transform it, maybe make it more palatable. Somehow there's a process that makes it more understandable to non-scientists. And this is a little diagram I come up with. I like drawing quite a bit, particularly conceptual sketches like this. This is coming in with some of my design background. When I think about what is knowledge brokering in my own mind, I said I needed to kind of give you an image. I see part of it is the paradigm building, which is occurring on the left side of the screen. And then, these are the ideas. And then they get woven together through relationships with people, exchanging those ideas. The ideas may change and transform. And eventually what comes out is a kind of a deeper level of organization. I call it helix building. This could be interdisciplinary teams. They could be certain approaches. They could be methods. But what we're beginning to see is that through this exchange process that we have a different type of structure coming out. And also organization, but also new relationships and ideas. So when we look at the cultural dimension of ecosystem services, one of my colleagues said, it's very difficult to define. It's almost like kind of the human dimensions of the environment. And when I picked these words, I was trying to capture the idea that in many ways, when we think about cultural services on one of the 4 categories, it kind of compartmentalizes it. And then it's that list of all the different possibilities, recreation, tourism. It's a list of things. It can be very helpful. But the challenges in trying to develop a list is that you're trying to describe a whole or a whole system. And so that's one reason why I gravitated back to the idea, and others have had this idea, that this kind of cultural dimension interlinks provisioning, supporting, regulating, and cultural. This is particularly true in highly modified and intensively used landscapes like in cities. It also has this idea that it has a strong society-nature interactions between individuals and collectives and networks. And this also can have a strong kind of psychological, social, and cultural relationships among people and landscapes. And what I bring to this, my background is not only in landscape architecture, but I spend most of my time in landscape ecology. And so very much I look at kind of the landscape perspective on things. When we begin thinking about this cultural dimension, we can start thinking of metaphors. Old-growth forests would be a typical kind of ecosystems that would have very strong cultural ecosystem services, particularly for its significance to the science and the kinds of habitats and species that live there. It represents, something that's probably quite rare and unusual in many places now. But it also can go into sort of more microscale, like particular plants like this Japanese maple that is really kind of closely related to being bred by a particular cultural group and its identity. You can also have cultural ecosystem services that are closely related to sustainability. And this is a particular project in Seattle. I think it's a condominium. And what it is, it's a form of absorbing the water. I guess you could call it kind of a water harvesting off the roof and kind of collecting it in different ways and have small little planters. But this image is well known in landscape architecture. It's appeared in a number of magazines. It has very kind of, I guess you could say, symbolic value of the way natural processes and people interact. The designers will use the term ecologies to represent natural process or ecological process when they talk about projects like this. When we talk about highly modified and intensively used landscapes, these are ones that where people's decisions and actions and behaviors have highly altered the land use and land cover. Really, you're probably in landscapes where maybe only about 20% or less of the original landscape is still intact. They're called highly fragmented. Fragmentation can occur at with different factors and scales. It could be kind of landscape fragmentation, but there's also other types of fragmentation. Could be from connection to place or kind of fragmentation that occurs in different movement of animal species across the landscape, or the fragmentation and isolation of different habitats. I'm particularly interested in urbanization and how it transforms ecosystem services in landscapes. And so when we think about this transformation in urban landscapes, one would be kind of thinking about the word sprawl. This is outside of the Twin Cities at the urban edge, how we have kind of the displacement of probably agricultural land changing to a different land use, land cover, but the idea that the ecosystem services are changing due to particular people's decisions to enjoy the views and country living and having a nice landscape, but also having the space to in this kind of landscape. We can also deal with more dense landscapes, like the city center. This is Seattle. This would be an example of urban sealing, how that greatly varies ecosystem services, but also kind of the cultural relationship to the whole development process that emerges out of this. And also the factors that it affects in terms of ecosystem processes, particularly if you think about the urban heat island or how water changes different patterns. There's an entirely new infrastructure that is built to, I guess you could say, provide ecosystem services that would be provided by nature, but kind of, I guess you could say, a type of human service from the infrastructure. So one question is, what level of connectivity is sustainable or even desirable for urban ecosystem services in cities that are so highly modified? And there's a lot of debate in the design fields about this issue. Probably the most common approaches are regreening. This is in Chicago. This is City Farm, which is on a lot in the Gold Coast section of the neighborhood. And then it juxtaposed, these are tomato plants, that is right up against the skyline. So this can have very kind of, and then you get into the whole idea of rewilding of cities, where this is in Portland. This is a design by Herbert Dreisaitl, who is a well-known landscape architect and artist, who essentially proposed, I guess you could say, revealing the wetland that used to be here that had been developed over time with urban development. This is in the Pearl District of Portland, you know, kind of one of the big capitals of sustainability. But when you get into landscapes like this with the cultural dimension, you have this kind of really deep symbolic value of the particular habitats, and whether they're kind of exact replicas, that's probably, you know, a lot of debate. But it's that kind of juxtaposition of the wild versus kind of the artistic wall with a sculpting wall, and providing people a particular experience, trying to reconnect them. So there are particular opportunities that come out of this whole process with the cultural dimension. One is that there's the opportunity for an interdisciplinary dialogue between science and design. This has been ongoing in landscape ecology for probably about 30 years, since the first workshop in Allerton, Illinois in 1983. Now this is the World Congress of Landscape Ecology in Beijing. It's gotten much larger. And in Beijing, what I was really struck by was that design had a prominent role, particularly in the eco-cities approaches. There was some really tight interweaving of science, of monitoring designed landscapes that we don't typically see in the United States. There are probably selective projects, but my feeling was that there was some really interesting processes going on in China. But what happens is that this dialogue of emergence is very key to understanding, making that cultural dimension of ecosystem services more robust. Because as one goes through the scientific literature about ecosystem services, it has some great strengths, particularly natural capital, and how the economic and the ecological perspectives have come together to try to quantify ecosystem services. The challenge is that there are some kind of social scientists questioning, saying that the emphasis is more on probably understanding the supporting, regulating, and provisioning aspects of ecosystem services more than cultural. And that's due to the complexity of the cultural dimension, but also maybe people's training. You know, it's like this is the first pass through to kind of establish everything. But I think now it's kind of extending out and saying, how can we make ecosystem services more robust as a concept? And so it gets into the more challenging side of people's perceptions of nature, their attitudes, values, beliefs, how that influences their behaviors and actions. And so we get back to this idea, very conceptual idea, about what do knowledge brokers do in this process in terms of paradigm building and knowledge weaving and helix building? This process can happen at several different levels. One is that it works with individual group projects. They could be interdisciplinary. It could be teaching students. It could be developing their leadership skills, but it also could be working with communities. One question is, how do you make scientific paradigms more understandable to people, particularly who might have variable levels of understanding science? And this is where, when you look at a process like this, why it's so important to have bridging concepts that people can understand. One of the most important ones would be resilience. That is something that everyday people can understand, the idea that something bounces back after change. The challenge is explaining it to people what are sort of the ecological definitions of resilience in that perspective. But also when you look in design, they have their own definitions of resilience. Their resilience is more about recovering after disaster and really kind of an integrated community approach to help communities recover. And so there could be a much more human emphasis on that, where maybe the resilience from ecology is more on the ecosystem or landscape itself. So, but these kind of two approaches could be very complementary for one another, especially in the urban landscape. When we get into my fellowship, this is a conceptual diagram that I had submitted to talk about what I wanted to do as a knowledge broker. And one is that I've always been interested in the link between curiosity-driven research about environmental phenomenon and professionally driven application about placemaking. To me, this is where the two worlds that I work with come together. One is scientists who I might work with on my research projects, but then how do we take that knowledge and make it usable for professionally driven application? It is a very specific aspect of knowledge brokering, because if you can train landscape architects, and other professions of the built environment, they're the ones who can go out and influence communities and what they look like in terms of urban form and ecosystem services. So with my students, I work very much towards translating this kind for their professionally driven projects, and to help them understand what are the most important scientific concepts, what are the bridging concepts. Because in landscape architecture, ecosystem service is mentioned, but not necessarily a natural vocabulary word like in the sciences. That is really a kind of a meta concept that organizes interdisciplinary teams, the way of thinking, funding, organizations. In design, it's probably more about places and people. Ecosystem services there, they'll say that's important, but it's the question of how do we maybe get these ideas to integrate more deeply. And for my particular agenda, I was interested in IonE's agenda with curiosity-driven research and the professionally driven application, but how does that link to climate and design? When we begin thinking about this, I have the themes of cultural dimension of ecosystem services, but particularly a concept I call cultivating our own deep nature and deep care for the environment. The question is, how can we help people develop a deeper connection to the environment based on their particular perspectives, their cultures? This is a long-term goal, but one that has been elusive for science. Even though science will have a strong ethical basis for this, the question is, how do you move the science towards what people understand and can accept? And so you can see in year 1, 2, and 3, I have these different themes about paradigm building, weaving knowledge, and helix building. So it's very much a work in progress, and working with people who are receptive to these ideas. And so when you begin thinking about specific topics, I'm interested in the urban heat island. This is a view from Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary into St. Paul, the downtown. You know, a good example of a kind of a landscape view of the urban heat island between the differences of impervious surfaces and built environment and urban form. The other would be urban plants, ecosystem services, and changing climate regimes. This is the Hortus Botanicus in Amsterdam. And when we begin thinking about cultures that have really adapted to their particular landscape, but also changing landscape. We think of the Netherlands as one of the most perfect examples because they've had to design their landscapes to deal with water flow. So here we see a culture that is deeply in tune with how can you manage a landscape but also provide ecosystem services that can still maintain the ecological processes but also deliver ecosystem services. And they also have spatial planning and design deeply embedded within their governance structure, very unique within the world. In the United States, our governance structure is more focused on policy and maybe some to planning, but the idea of design of the landscape is not fully integrated. There's probably opportunities to do that, but for this particular culture where resources, they're in a difficult position with flooding and their landscape position being in the deltas of several major rivers, they've had to adapt by this, it's required. But you can also look at this and saying this landscape is also highly maintained. So there's also kind of cultural issues there about this, how landscapes should be managed. But when you look into some of our sustainable landscapes, those are also managed to a certain degree. This is a green street in Portland, one of their prototype projects that they have ongoing, where we have the actual right-of-way instead of trees. It's been replaced with a rain garden, but in some ways it's a very particular type of rain garden, and it emphasizes grasses. This particular planting tradition is different than probably the kind of traditions we have in the Twin Cities where they emphasize probably beautiful flowers. Beautiful flowers are a big selling point for people. They help with social norms and acceptance of these landscapes. But here we see probably one that is much more specialized towards an ecosystem service, kind of explaining why would we have these types of grasses and plants versus other. Maybe they have particular advantages with this particular water situation. The other opportunity we have with this kind of cultural dimension of ecosystem services is linking into some of the major ideas that are organizing discussions about sustainability. One is knowledge systems for sustainable development. This is from an article by Cash et al. It's well known. It was in the proceedings of the Academy of Sciences, where they talked about how do you make knowledge more useful and transferable. There's three criteria they developed: saliency, legitimacy, and credibility. Another idea is the idea of brokered knowledge, new forms of knowledge. This is by a recent paper by Mayer, who talks about the rise of the knowledge broker. And what we're beginning to see is that maybe brokered knowledge is the kind that I'm talking that comes out of this knowledge brokering process. It is more robust, it is more transferable, and it's more useful. It builds the ideas that Mayer has come up with, it kind of works very nicely with the knowledge systems for sustainable development because it finds some very nice complementary terms. Some of the challenges that we face with dealing with the cultural dimension of ecosystem services and knowledge broking. One is that it's just the sheer immensity of the cultural dimension, very broad, requires many experts. I still kind of scratch my head about how this can really happen. I think it would be probably place-specific, project-specific, very specificity. It's harder to take it as kind of a big picture issue. But it is helpful to understand it's in relation to ecosystem services. Disciplinary boundaries and tradition can be one of the challenges. Sometimes we think about the silos of knowledge. I think those things have been changing, but it's still, challenging. The readiness of science and design for integration, the complexity of defining ecosystem services and its cultural dimension, which I just mentioned, public understanding of climate and weather issues, even trying to help people understand the difference between weather versus climate, I think is going to be one of the big issues, but also how it might change the landscape that they're currently living in. And the question, should we be using more resilient strategies or resistant strategies to provide ecosystem services to enhance and maintain them? There's an interesting article by Miller et al. About forests, and they talk quite a bit about resistance versus resilient strategies. And it's one of those challenges because conservation, we may have very unique species that need to be protected, kind of the arc of biodiversity, but then you also have this kind of transition, should we have kind of assisted migration and have people really get active in this process. I think that this will be one of the debates that will be emerging in the next 10 to 20 years that will really help shape people's attitudes about landscapes and climate and weather. especially when we begin realizing that the weather is starting to become more like climate as the decades go by and it becomes the new normal. We also have this idea of social acceptance of alternative landscapes and plant species. Those could be called sustainable landscapes. They could be green roofs, green walls, community gardens, all sorts and types, whether people will want that. Some people may really want this because they can get closer contact with nature. It's that idea of softening the matrix within all the landscape of sealed surfaces within and the impervious surfaces. Other challenges we might end up having is that as we adapt to all these different changing climate regimes, will we end up with just miniature versions of existing landscape? This is a terrarium at the Hortus Botanicus in the Netherlands, and it's a beautiful miniaturization of nature, but does it provide the same level of ecosystem services than the previous one? Will we end up with these small remnant landscapes that are of the previous type? And there is precedence for it. I mean, when the glaciers came through, there are relictual landscapes. When I lived in Texas, there are small relictual landscapes that are left over from when it was a cooler climate and wetter, and they're kind of protected within canyons and things, and they form kind of the backbone of some of the state parks. But in changing climates, the question is, those occurred naturally. Do we protect these? We have a conservation process where we actually protect landscapes like that. And for people, it could be highly important to do that. Others would be, are we just going to end up propping nature with Band-Aids? Because it's just so precious. It could be a positive, it could be a negative, but it's the kind of idea where here we have the intersection of design, maybe an infrastructure to protect something that's very important. And it could be very important from an ecosystem services perspective, like for flooding or for air quality. So when we start looking at these definitions and opportunities and challenges, we begin thinking about the future, about where we could go and where we could end up being. And I would say that this idea of the knowledge broker is someone who's emerging between the world of science and application. You could call it a third culture. It's not necessarily gotten a lot of credit, but it's something that I think it's an emerging role that probably some of our students and professionals and scientists may have naturally gravitated towards, but we may not have really kind of labeled it with a strong role, but also talk about the process of knowledge and how it develops and how it's so intricate of networks with ideas and people. But particularly when you look at the cultural dimension of ecosystem services in cities, this is where probably knowledge brokers can serve an important role, kind of acknowledging it, but also maybe participating in more specific, concrete dialogues. So that's everything I have to present. If you'd like to get a hold of me, here's my email address. And I'm willing to take any questions. Thank you.